They say Rome didn't fall in a single night. But they don't tell you about the night when the air in the city felt different. The markets were still lit with flickering torches, wine still spilled from goblets, and the laughter of nobles still echoed through the marble halls, yet deep beneath it all, something was dying. And the worst part? No one could see it until it was far too late. Picture it, the year is 410 AD, and the gates of the eternal city have been breached. Not by some vast army of equal power, but by people the Romans once mocked as savages. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, pour into the streets. And yet, that's not where our story truly begins. No, our story begins years earlier, in a place no Roman citizen thought mattered. Far to the east, in dusty provinces where Rome's grip was already loosening, small rebellions flared. Not great battles, not yet. Just whispers, a refusal to pay taxes, a local garrison that switched allegiance overnight. These moments were overlooked by senators in their marble chambers, but they were tremors before the earthquake. And that's the truth about the fall of Rome. It wasn't a single, dramatic collapse, it was a slow unraveling. But if you think that makes it less tragic, wait until you hear what came next. The city's senators argued endlessly. Grain shipments from North Africa, the lifeblood of the capital, were delayed by storms, piracy, and incompetence. Hungry citizens became restless. They whispered that the gods had turned away from Rome. Meanwhile, the empire's soldiers, men who had once bled for Rome on distant frontiers, began to realize that their loyalty could be bought by anyone. But let's leap forward, or maybe backward, because the real moment Rome's fate was sealed didn't happen in its streets, or even in Italy at all. It happened in a battlefield hundreds of miles away, under the shadow of a gray and blood-soaked sky, when a Roman general made a choice that would echo for centuries. Flavius Stilicho, Rome's greatest commander at the time, was ordered to defend the empire against those very barbarians who would one day sack the city. But politics in Rome was a venomous game, and Stilicho found himself accused of treason. Imagine this, the man who could have saved the empire was executed, by his own people. Thousands of barbarian soldiers under his command, suddenly leaderless and betrayed, defected to the enemy. Rome didn't just open its gates that day, it handed the keys away. And yet, even as disaster loomed, the heart of Rome kept beating. In the Forum, merchants still hawked their wares. Philosophers still debated under the colonnades. Children still played in the shadow of the great temples. Life went on, as it always does, even on the edge of ruin. But here's the question that haunts every historian: could Rome have been saved? The answer is tangled. Because while enemies gathered outside, enemies also gathered inside. Corruption was no longer the shameful secret of a few powerful men, it was the system itself. Gold meant more than honor. Alliances shifted with every rumor. And the emperors? They changed so often that people joked Rome had become a revolving door of rulers. In some years, the empire saw more assassinations than victories. Now, jump with me to a cold winter night. The Tiber River runs black under the moonlight. In a small villa at the city's edge, an old senator sits alone. His name has been lost to history, but his words, scratched into a letter we still have, remain chilling. The walls stand, the statues stand, but the soul of Rome has left us. He wrote that not as an enemy, but as a man watching his world disappear, piece by piece. And this is what people don't understand about the fall of Rome. It wasn't just soldiers and swords. It was hunger. It was betrayal. It was leaders killing their own saviors. It was the people themselves, looking at the city they loved and realizing they no longer believed in it. Centuries of glory had built a Rome so vast it believed itself eternal. But eternity doesn't exist for empires. Still, there was one last moment, one last hope. A desperate gamble. Alaric, the Visigoth king, didn't originally want to destroy Rome. He wanted a deal: gold, land, recognition. Rome could have given it to him. They could have spared themselves the humiliation of the sack. But the senators refused. Pride, the same pride that had built their empire, now blinded them. And so, on that hot summer day in 410, the gates opened. We will never know if the guards were bribed, threatened, or simply gave up. What we do know is that for 3 days, the eternal city burned. Statues that had stood for centuries were pulled down. Families fled. The streets that had once echoed with the triumph of legions now echoed with screams. But here's where it gets strange, and this is the part you need to remember. Even in the chaos, even as Rome burned, not everything was lost. The city survived. People rebuilt. Life returned. Which means the fall of Rome wasn't the end. It was a transformation. And transformations are never painless. And that's why I need you to stay with me, all the way to the end. Because the real truth about the fall of Rome isn't what you think. It's not just about barbarians or weak emperors. It's about us, about every empire, every nation, every system that believes it's too big to fail. Rome's story is our warning, and trust me, the ending will make you see the modern world in a way you can't unsee. The marble streets of Rome had always gleamed in the sun, polished smooth by centuries of footsteps, soldiers, senators, slaves, merchants. But in certain corners, where weeds grew between the stones, you could see the neglect. That neglect wasn't sudden, it crept in quietly, like a shadow that lengthens at dusk. In the year 376, long before the sack of Rome, a wave of desperate refugees arrived at the Danube River. They were the Goths, fleeing the unstoppable advance of the Huns. They asked Rome for sanctuary, for a place to settle inside imperial borders. Rome agreed, not out of generosity, but out of calculation. The empire saw an opportunity to turn these newcomers into soldiers. What they didn't see was the seed of their own undoing. Corrupt Roman officials extorted the refugees, selling them rotten food at outrageous prices. Families starved, and resentment festered. Within 2 years, the Goths rebelled. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378, they shattered a Roman army and killed Emperor Valens himself. Historians later called it one of the worst defeats in Rome's history, but in the streets of the capital, the news was met with a strange silence. Wars on distant frontiers had become so common that for many Romans, it was just another story. Yet even then, the empire wasn't broken. The machinery of Rome was vast, losses could be absorbed. Taxes were raised. New armies were recruited. Roads, aqueducts, and markets kept running. From a distance, it looked like stability. But inside, the foundations were weakening. Jump forward to the palace of Honorius, decades later. The emperor, a pale, withdrawn man, spends his days breeding exotic chickens, giving them names like they were members of the imperial court. Outside his marble walls, provinces are falling. But inside, the illusion holds. Rome had always been good at illusions, grand parades, towering monuments, triumphant speeches, even when the truth was rotting underneath. Some of that rot came from decisions made centuries earlier. When the empire split into East and West in 285 AD under Diocletian, it seemed like a practical move, 2 emperors to govern 2 halves of a massive realm. The East, centered on the wealthy city of Constantinople, grew stronger, richer, more defensible. The West did not. Rome itself became less and less important, the emperors moving their courts to Milan, Ravenna, and elsewhere. By the time disaster came, the Eternal City was a symbol more than a center of power. But symbols can be dangerous things. People fight for them long after they've lost their true meaning. Consider the Roman Senate in the early 5th century. Once the beating heart of the Republic, it had become a club for the elite, aristocrats more concerned with preserving their own wealth than preserving the empire. Landowners refused to pay taxes, hiding their estates behind legal tricks. Generals refused to march without guarantees of gold. The army itself was no longer truly Roman. Germanic mercenaries, hired for their skill in battle, served alongside what remained of the citizen legions. Their loyalty was to gold, not the eagle standards of Rome. And yet, in moments, the old spirit still appeared. When news came that the Vandals had crossed into North Africa, seizing Rome's grain supply, panic spread through the capital. Riots broke out. People cried for the gods to intervene, for the emperor to act. But action was slow, uncertain, tangled in politics. The Vandals were not just raiders, they were a mirror, showing the empire what it had become, opportunistic, ruthless, and without mercy. The fall wasn't just about battles. It was about choices, 1,000 small decisions that, taken together, formed a path no one could leave. Think of the day when Stilicho, Rome's greatest general, was accused of plotting with the enemy. There was no proof, but proof was never the point. His enemies in the court whispered poison into the emperor's ear, and the mob in the streets finished the work. Stilicho was executed in 408 AD. With him gone, Rome lost not only a commander but a shield. The barbarian troops under his command deserted to Alaric. And in that single, bloody day, the gates to the city became a little less secure. Now imagine another scene, far from the marble of the capital. A Roman village in Gaul. Smoke curls from the chimneys, the fields are bare after harvest. Suddenly, riders appear on the horizon, not Roman cavalry, but strangers in furs, their weapons flashing in the low winter sun. The villagers know the garrisons are gone. The empire's borders, once patrolled and guarded, have been stripped bare. The strangers ride in. They take what they want. They leave nothing. For the villagers, the fall of Rome has already happened. The empire was too large to see itself clearly. When provinces fell, others still prospered. When cities burned, others still celebrated. It was like watching a great tree rot from the roots while its upper branches still flowered in spring. Back in the capital, omens filled the air. In the summer of 410, the Tiber flooded. Statues cracked without warning. Lightning struck the great basilicas. The superstitious whispered that the gods had abandoned Rome for good. The Christians in the city claimed the old gods were powerless now, their temples empty shells. The pagans blamed the Christians for angering Jupiter and Mars. Faith became another battlefield, as vicious as any fought with swords. Meanwhile, Alaric moved closer. He was no mindless destroyer, he was calculating, patient. He had once served in the Roman army. He knew its weaknesses, its politics, its arrogance. His demands were not impossible: food, gold, and a place for his people. But the senators scoffed. Rome had never bowed to outsiders, at least, not openly. And yet, hadn't it already? Centuries earlier, when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he ended the old republic forever. When emperors relied on foreign troops to fight their wars, they invited the world into their army. When bribes and assassinations became the path to power, they traded strength for survival. These weren't sudden betrayals. They were choices made again and again until they felt normal. The sack of Rome, when it came, was almost an afterthought in this long story. But before that moment, there was a strange interlude. Alaric actually entered negotiations with Rome, twice. Both times, the deals collapsed over pride and mistrust. The senators called him a barbarian, he called them liars. History turned on those conversations in shadowed halls, where no one kept an honest record of the words spoken. One night, the people of Rome went to bed under the protection of their walls, the moon casting silver light on the forum. By morning, those same walls would not save them. The gates, it said, were open from within, whether by treachery or desperation, no one could agree. The Visigoths entered not as an unstoppable wave but as a slow, steady tide. The city's great monuments stood untouched at first. Alaric was not interested in destroying marble, he wanted wealth and supplies. But the order soon broke down. Soldiers took what they could. Temples were looted. The gold from centuries of conquest left in the hands of those who had once been conquered. Still, this was not the end. The sack of 410 did not erase Rome. The Senate continued to meet. The markets reopened. Children played in the ruins of buildings their grandparents had seen in glory. Life has a way of persisting, even after disaster. But the damage was done, not in stone, but in the mind. The aura of invincibility was gone. For centuries, Rome had been the center of the world. Now, the world had seen it bleed. And in some ways, that was the true fall, not the loss of territory or treasures, but the loss of belief. Once people stop believing in an empire, it becomes only a matter of time before the rest follows. A lone bell tolls in the early morning fog, its sound echoing over rooftops blackened by old fires. Somewhere in the city, a rooster crows, as if mocking the silence. The streets of Rome, once choked with the clatter of carts and the cries of merchants, are nearly empty. It is not that the people have vanished, they are still here, in their cramped tenements and crumbling villas, but the life of the city feels muted, as though it is holding its breath. Years after the sack of 410, Rome still bore the scars, but time had also layered new wounds upon the old. The Vandals had taken Africa, the empire's breadbasket, and with it went the steady grain shipments that had fed the capital for generations. Hunger gnawed at the poor first, then at the wealthy, who discovered that gold could no longer buy what no ship brought. Yet, in the Senate chambers, the arguments remained the same. Blame was passed around like a cup of sour wine, bitter, yet impossible to put down. Some senators argued for new military campaigns, others for negotiations, but few were willing to risk their own fortunes. The empire had learned to speak in grand terms while acting in cautious whispers. But Rome's decline wasn't only measured in lost battles and empty granaries. It was in the way people looked at one another in the streets, suspicion replacing trust, resignation replacing pride. It was in the graffiti scratched into the walls, prayers to Christ beside curses against the emperor, crude drawings of ships sailing away, and the occasional desperate plea for someone, anyone, to restore the old greatness. To see where the real fracture lay, you have to travel beyond the city. Northward, past the ruins of villas abandoned to weeds, through forests that had once been farmland, to the borderlands where the empire's control was more rumor than reality. There, local chieftains, nominally loyal to Rome, collected their own taxes, maintained their own militias, and kept Roman officials at arm's length. For them, the emperor's authority was a banner they raised when it suited them, and ignored when it didn't. Some of these border lords were former Roman officers, men who had once commanded legions in the name of the empire. Now, they served only themselves, their loyalty secured by the land they claimed and the swords they paid. The empire, in its desperation, had created them, granting them power in exchange for protection, and in doing so, had surrendered its monopoly on strength. In Constantinople, far to the east, the Eastern Empire watched all this with a mix of pity and contempt. The East was richer, stronger, safer behind its walls. Its rulers still called themselves emperors of Rome, but when the West begged for help, the answers came slowly, wrapped in excuses. The unity of the empire was a fiction kept alive by tradition and memory. And yet, there were moments when it seemed the West might still recover. Generals like Aetius rose from the chaos, men capable of rallying scattered forces, of forging alliances with former enemies. Aetius in particular understood the language of power in this new, fractured world. He struck deals with Huns, Visigoths, and Franks alike, playing each against the other. To some, he was the last great Roman. To others, a dangerous gambler. But his victories bought time, and time, for a dying empire, was as precious as gold. Still, every reprieve carried its own cost. Rome had always prided itself on absorbing outsiders, turning them into citizens, soldiers, even leaders. But by the 5th century, the balance had shifted. The newcomers were no longer being shaped by Rome, Rome was being shaped by them. The Latin tongue blended with foreign words. Roman armor was traded for styles borrowed from across the Rhine and the Danube. The laws bent to accommodate new customs. These changes weren't always visible in the marble heart of the city, but in the provinces, they were unmistakable. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps true, of a Roman senator traveling through Gaul during these years. He arrives in a town that flies the imperial standard, pays taxes to the emperor, and swears loyalty to Rome. But the guards at the gate speak a tongue he does not understand. The governor wears trousers, not a toga. And when the senator mentions the emperor's name, he is met with polite indifference. Rome's shadow still falls on the town, but its light no longer reaches there. In the capital, religious conflict added another crack to the foundation. Christianity had long since taken root, but it was not a single, unified faith. Factions within the church fought over doctrine with as much passion as any legion fought over land. The pagans, though diminished, still held pockets of influence and yearned for the old rituals, the old gods. Temples stood empty or converted into churches, their statues defaced or hidden away. The city's identity was no longer a shared thing, it was a battleground of ideas. And always, beyond the frontiers, new threats gathered. The Huns, with their swift horses and brutal raids, pushed other tribes ahead of them like floodwaters breaking through a dam. These displaced peoples, Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, Franks, pressed into Roman lands, not as raiders but as entire nations seeking space to live. Rome could no longer decide who entered, it could only decide on what terms. Sometimes, those terms were generous. Land was granted, citizenship offered, treaties signed. Other times, betrayal followed quickly on the heels of diplomacy. The result was a world where alliances shifted overnight and yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's invader. One such shift came when the Vandals, settled in Spain under treaty, turned their eyes southward. Crossing into Africa, they seized Carthage in 439, not just a city, but the key to the empire's grain supply. The blow was devastating. Without African grain, Rome could not feed its population. Bread prices soared. Riots erupted. The city's leaders tried to negotiate, but the Vandals, secure in their new stronghold, had no reason to compromise. In the Senate, voices called for an expedition to retake Africa. Ships were gathered, soldiers recruited. But when the fleet sailed, storms scattered it, and what remained was crushed by Vandal forces. The defeat was more than military, it was psychological. The empire's enemies had learned that Rome could be beaten on land and sea alike. And yet, even in defeat, Rome clung to its identity. Processions still wound through the streets on feast days. The old laws were still recited in the Forum. The coin still bore the image of the emperor, though his power was a fraction of what it had been. This was the strange duality of the empire in its last centuries. The shell remained, even as the core crumbled. If you walked through Rome in these years, you would still see grandeur. The Colosseum stood, though its games were rarer now. The aqueducts still carried water, though repairs came slower. The baths were still open, though fewer could afford them. But behind the facades, the wealth that had built it all was slipping away, carried off to foreign capitals or hidden in the vaults of private estates. Perhaps the most haunting thing about Rome's decline was not its violence, but its familiarity. It did not fall in a single, clear catastrophe. It faded, piece by piece, in ways that seemed survivable, until they weren't. The borders shrank, the armies thinned, the treasury emptied, but the city endured. People told themselves that as long as Rome itself stood, the empire could be restored. And so, they rebuilt after every disaster. They filled the Senate seats after every purge. They crowned new emperors after every assassination. It was a cycle of renewal that masked the truth. Each renewal was weaker than the last. The empire was not dying in one great collapse, it was being worn down, like a statue exposed to centuries of wind and rain, its features slowly losing their shape. Far away, in the lands beyond the empire's reach, new kingdoms were forming, kingdoms built by those who had once feared and hated Rome. They learned from Rome's strengths, avoided its mistakes when they could, and watched as their former conqueror struggled to defend its own heart. The balance of power was shifting, and the world was beginning to belong to someone else. By the time most Romans realized it, the change was irreversible. The city was still here. The name was still here. But the empire they thought they lived in existed only in memory. A cold wind swept through the forum, carrying with it the smell of rain and smoke. Statues stood silent, their marble faces worn smooth by centuries, their eyes staring into a future they would never see. Once, this place had been the center of the world, emperors proclaimed, victories celebrated, laws passed that bound millions. Now, weeds pushed up through the cracks in the stones, and beggars huddled in the shadows of colonnades built to honor gods and men long gone. The year was 455. The gates of Rome stood open again, not for an army of rescue, but for the Vandals. They came with ships, sleek and swift, cutting across the Mediterranean like knives. Carthage had already been theirs for years, and with it the power to choke Rome's grain supply. Now, they came for the city itself. This time, there was little resistance. The empire's forces were scattered, its alliances thin. The Vandals entered almost as if they were guests, but they came to take, not to admire. For 2 weeks, the eternal city was stripped bare. Gold and silver from its temples, treasures from its palaces, even the bronze fittings from its public buildings were carried away to Africa. The Vandals left the walls standing, but they hollowed out the heart. And still, Rome endured. That was the strange, almost cruel truth of its decline. After every humiliation, it remained. People returned to the markets, rebuilt their homes, held their festivals. The city refused to die, even as the empire around it withered away. To understand why it lasted so long, you must look not only at its strength but at its stubbornness. Rome had always been a master of adaptation, taking from other cultures, reshaping what it took into something new. But in its last centuries, that skill became a trap. The city could adjust to anything, survive any blow, but in doing so, it never truly addressed the wounds. It learned to live with loss, to endure decay, and so the decay spread. Go back to the provinces and you see the other side of this endurance. In Gaul, Britain, and Spain, Roman authority was little more than a memory. Local leaders ruled in the emperor's name, but their power came from their own armies and lands. The empire's taxes were collected, when they were collected at all, to fund local defenses rather than send tribute to Rome. Each province became a world unto itself, tied to the capital by tradition more than by law. Britain had been abandoned decades earlier, its legions recalled to defend closer threats. The towns the Romans had built there fell into disrepair. Roads cracked, villas crumbled, the baths grew cold. The people still remembered Rome, but their Rome was a ghost, an image of order and prosperity that no longer existed even in the city itself. Meanwhile, in Italy, the imperial court moved like a shadow from one city to another, Milan, Ravenna, anywhere safer than Rome. The emperor was no longer the undisputed ruler of the West. He was one among many power brokers, often at the mercy of his own generals. Some of those generals were Romans, others were men from beyond the empire's borders, raised to high command because they had the soldiers the emperor needed. One of the most famous was Ricimer, a man of mixed Swabi and Gothic descent. He never took the imperial title himself, but he made and unmade emperors as he saw fit. To many, he was the real power in the West during the mid-5th century. His rise was a sign of how far the old order had shifted. The emperors wore the crown, but others held the sword. In the East, Constantinople still stood in brilliance, its walls unbreached, its treasury full. The Eastern emperors still claimed lordship over the West, but their help came grudgingly, if at all. The distance between the two halves of the empire was more than physical, it was political, cultural, and perhaps inevitable. And then came the year 476. It would later be marked as the official fall of the Western Roman Empire, though those who lived through it may not have seen it that way. The emperor at the time, Romulus Augustulus, was a boy, perhaps 16. His rule was in name only, granted to him by his father, the general Orestes. But Orestes had made a dangerous choice. The barbarian troops who served in the Roman army demanded land in Italy as payment for their service. Orestes refused, perhaps fearing the backlash from the senatorial class. The troops, led by a chieftain named Odoacer, revolted. They marched on Ravenna, the imperial capital, and Orestes was killed. Odoacer did not slaughter the young emperor. Instead, he deposed him and sent him into comfortable exile in Campania. There was no grand battle, no final siege of Rome itself. The Western Empire simply ended. The imperial regalia was sent to Constantinople, along with a message: the West no longer needed its own emperor. One ruler, in the East, would suffice. In the streets of Rome, life went on. Markets opened, children played, priests led processions. There had been no fire, no storming of the walls, nothing to mark the day as different from the one before. But something profound had changed. For the first time in over 1,000 years, there was no Roman emperor in the West. The idea of Rome as the center of power had finally passed into history. And yet, the city itself remained a prize, fought over by the kingdoms that rose in the empire's shadow. The Ostrogoths took it, ruling Italy with a blend of Roman administration and Gothic custom. Later, the Byzantines would reclaim it for a time, sending their armies across the sea to restore what they called the Roman order. Then came the Lombards, then the Franks. Rome became a city of many rulers, but never again the master of them all. Its monuments still stood, though many were stripped for building materials. Marble was burned for lime, bronze statues melted down for coins or weapons. The Colosseum, once an arena of blood and spectacle, became a quarry and a fortress. The aqueducts fell into disrepair, and whole districts were abandoned. But the heart of the city, its people, its faith, its memory, survived. In the centuries that followed, Rome's name would echo far beyond its walls. Kings and emperors across Europe claimed its legacy. The church, centered in the city, wielded spiritual authority that often surpassed the political power of kings. Pilgrims came from distant lands to walk its ancient streets, to touch the stones that had seen the rise and fall of empires. This is the paradox of Rome's fall: it never truly ended. The empire as a political entity dissolved, but its culture, its laws, its roads, its language, all lived on, reshaped and reimagined by those who came after. The Rome that ruled the world was gone. The Rome that shaped it had only begun. Still, if you listen in the quiet corners of the city, beneath the drone of modern life, you might hear the faint echo of another Rome, the Rome of legions and triumphs, of senators in white togas, of marble temples gleaming in the sun. That Rome is gone, but its shadow lingers, stretched across centuries, a reminder that even the mightiest can fall, and yet remain.